Breaking news: tension has reached a critical point in the Baltic region. According to multiple intelligence sources, Russian forces in Kaliningrad, the country's westernmost enclave, have been effectively isolated after Poland and Sweden intensified military coordination along the borders and surrounding waters. Official statements from Moscow downplay the situation, describing it as routine NATO activity, yet satellite imagery and eyewitness reports tell a different story. Troop movements, naval patrols, and restricted airspace suggest something far more serious. Kaliningrad, once touted as Russia's strategic outpost in Europe, is now under what analysts cautiously call a functional blockade. The escalation began quietly. Over recent weeks, Polish and Swedish forces increased joint exercises under the banner of regional security. At first, these maneuvers appeared symbolic, demonstrations of deterrence. But in the past few days, their tone has shifted. Observers now describe the presence of heavy artillery near the Suwalki corridor, the narrow strip of land linking Kaliningrad to Belarus, and expanded naval patrols across the Baltic Sea. Swedish reconnaissance planes operate daily, tracking Russian vessels leaving Kaliningrad's ports. Officially, these actions are framed as defensive, but in practice, they have sealed off nearly every route connecting the enclave to the outside world. Inside Kaliningrad, the atmosphere is tense and uncertain. Local residents report fuel shortages, restricted access to certain roads, and heightened military presence around strategic facilities. Supply deliveries from mainland Russia, already limited since the start of sanctions, are now disrupted by what Lithuanian authorities call enhanced inspection measures. Analysts warn that this administrative language masks a deeper strategy: the gradual isolation of Kaliningrad as leverage against Moscow. No one has declared a blockade, one European diplomat noted. But everyone understands that it's happening. In Moscow, officials insist that the situation remains stable. The Ministry of Defense speaks of planned logistics adjustments and dismisses foreign reports as exaggerations. Yet insiders close to the military acknowledge growing concern. The enclave houses one of Russia's largest stockpiles of conventional weapons and, reportedly, tactical nuclear systems. Its isolation raises questions not only of supply but of command. Communications between Kaliningrad and Moscow are strained, and analysts suggest that contingency plans for prolonged disconnection are being quietly reviewed. Kaliningrad was designed as a forward base, one military expert said. It was never meant to stand alone. For NATO, the developments mark a turning point. In Warsaw and Stockholm, officials frame their actions as precautionary, a response to what they call persistent destabilization by Russia. However, in private briefings, diplomats admit that the coordination has a strategic dimension. The aim, as one senior European official described, is to contain without confrontation. By limiting Kaliningrad's access, Western forces test Moscow's resolve while avoiding direct escalation. Yet such balancing acts are inherently unstable. Each maneuver increases the risk of miscalculation, and in the Baltic theater, even a single misstep could have consequences far beyond the region. Economically, the pressure is mounting inside the enclave. Businesses dependent on imports face shortages, while transport costs soar as goods must be rerouted through complex logistics chains. Fuel and food remain available, but residents report higher prices and rationing in smaller towns. The regional administration assures the public that supplies are sufficient, yet visible anxiety contradicts official calm. People remember 2022, one local resident told independent reporters. They know what happens when the borders tighten. Observers describe the situation as both fragile and symbolic. Kaliningrad represents more than territory, it embodies Russia's projection of power into Europe. For decades, it was portrayed as an unsinkable fortress, a reminder that Moscow's reach extended deep into NATO's backyard. Now that fortress appears vulnerable, encircled not by open hostility but by quiet suffocation. The symbolism resonates far beyond geography. What we are witnessing, an analyst in Brussels explained, is the reversal of the post-Cold War order, Russia's sphere of influence shrinking from the edges inward. International reactions remain measured but uneasy. In Berlin and Paris, officials urge restraint while expressing solidarity with Poland and Sweden. Washington has reiterated its commitment to NATO defense zones but refrained from direct commentary on Kaliningrad's status. The silence itself speaks volumes. Analysts note that the West appears united in its strategy: avoid provocation while tightening pressure. For Moscow, this combination is the most difficult to counter: no formal declaration of hostility, yet a practical encirclement that limits both movement and narrative. Inside Russia, state media maintains a controlled tone. Reports emphasize routine military readiness and depict NATO's activity as predictable aggression. However, social networks tell a different story. Families with relatives stationed in Kaliningrad post messages of concern, describing communication blackouts and delayed leave rotations. Independent observers confirm that morale among troops has dropped. They don't know what's next, one military correspondent admitted. They just know they're surrounded. For those who want to follow how this quiet siege, built not through war but through strategy, reshapes Russia's position in Europe and tests the balance of power across the Baltic, subscribing will ensure you stay connected to analysis that looks beyond military maneuvers to the deeper political realignments now unfolding. According to sources close to regional administrations, the situation around Kaliningrad has entered a new, more precarious phase. While no official state of emergency has been declared, the enclave now operates under what analysts call de facto isolation. Cargo shipments from mainland Russia, once routed through Belarus and Lithuania, face increasing delays and restrictions. Even air traffic has been limited, with international airlines avoiding nearby corridors for fear of escalation. Inside the region, fuel distribution is rationed, transport schedules are reduced, and the sense of encirclement deepens with each passing day. It's not a siege, one local official remarked cautiously, but it feels like one. Moscow continues to project confidence. The Ministry of Defense emphasizes that supply routes through the Baltic Sea remain open and that the fleet is ready to ensure stability. Yet maritime analysts point out that this route is neither efficient nor secure. Western naval patrols and aerial surveillance have effectively turned the Baltic into a transparent operating space. Every Russian vessel leaving Kaliningrad is tracked in real time, its movement constrained by international monitoring. The sea is open, but the perception of freedom is gone, one expert explained. They can sail, but not without being seen. Behind closed doors, the mood within Russia's political and military leadership is tense. Insiders describe long meetings marked by disagreement between ministries. Some advocate for diplomatic restraint, warning that any aggressive move could trigger NATO's collective response. Others call for decisive action, including large-scale exercises to demonstrate readiness. The result is paralysis, too much fear to escalate, too much pride to retreat. The Kremlin is trapped between symbolism and survival, a European diplomat commented. Kaliningrad is both a military asset and a political burden. Inside the enclave, civilian life becomes increasingly strained. Supermarkets remain stocked, but selection narrows with every week. Pharmacies report shortages of imported medicines, while local businesses struggle to secure spare parts for machinery. Residents notice more soldiers on the streets and fewer public events. The regional governor urges calm, promising that Moscow will not abandon us, but his tone carries unease. Independent observers report that local media have been instructed to avoid words like blockade, isolation, or shortage. Instead, official channels speak of temporary logistical adjustments. Yet in conversations off camera, citizens use a different language. They call it what it is: isolation. Economically, the pressure intensifies. Kaliningrad's industries, from shipbuilding to electronics, depend on steady imports of materials from mainland Russia and Europe. With routes disrupted, production slows, wages are delayed, and layoffs quietly begin. Analysts note that this microcosm reflects a larger trend within Russia: dependence on trade channels that no longer function reliably. The difference is that in Kaliningrad, there is nowhere else to turn. It's an island economy, one expert said. Cut it off, and it starts to sink. For NATO, the operation remains carefully calibrated. Poland continues to strengthen its military presence along the border, while Sweden coordinates naval patrols and air reconnaissance with Finland and the Baltic states. The stated goal remains defensive, but the coordination itself sends a message: Moscow's western flank is no longer uncontested. This is deterrence through visibility, a defense analyst in Stockholm explained. We're not attacking, but we're making sure they know they can't move unnoticed. The effect, however, is psychological as much as tactical. Each patrol, each flight, each radar sweep reinforces the impression of confinement. The Russian public, meanwhile, receives a filtered narrative. State television describes NATO's activity as provocation and celebrates Kaliningrad's strategic resilience. Maps displayed during broadcasts highlight the enclave as a bastion of defense, surrounded yet defiant. But online, alternative stories circulate: reports of restricted movement, soldiers requesting leave denials, and families losing contact with relatives stationed there. The official story is victory, one journalist noted, but the personal stories sound like isolation. Internationally, the situation prompts quiet concern. European capitals maintain public discipline, avoiding language that could be seen as escalatory, yet privately acknowledge that the risk of miscalculation is rising. Military aircraft from multiple countries share the same narrow skies, naval maneuvers occur within visual range. The Baltic has never been this crowded, a NATO official remarked. One wrong signal, and everything changes. Diplomats urge restraint, but analysts warn that prolonged tension without communication breeds accidents. In complex systems, they explain, silence can be as dangerous as aggression. For Moscow, the geopolitical implications extend beyond Kaliningrad itself. The isolation of the enclave challenges the entire concept of Russian power projection in Europe. If a single region, heavily fortified and symbolically crucial, can be contained without a single shot fired, it raises uncomfortable questions about the limits of influence. Military strategists privately concede that Kaliningrad's geography, once seen as an advantage, now exposes vulnerability. It's a fortress without corridors, one analyst said. And fortresses without corridors become prisons. The symbolic resonance of this moment cannot be overstated. Kaliningrad was once celebrated as the western window of Russian strength, the outpost proving that Moscow's reach had no boundaries. Today, that window looks inward. The more tightly the region is surrounded, the clearer it becomes that isolation, not expansion, defines Russia's position in Europe. Observers warn that what happens in Kaliningrad will not stay confined to the Baltic. It will shape how Russia's neighbors, and perhaps Russia itself, understand power in the years ahead. In Moscow, the situation surrounding Kaliningrad has become a test of both political will and narrative control. Officials present the encirclement as a temporary provocation, yet their actions suggest quiet alarm. Emergency meetings at the Ministry of Defense and the Security Council take place almost daily. Sources close to these discussions describe growing tension between the military, which urges visible countermeasures, and civilian officials, who prefer to avoid escalation. They all agree it's serious, one insider said. They just disagree on what to admit. The Kremlin's challenge lies not in managing the West but in managing perception at home, to project strength without revealing fear. For years, Kaliningrad was portrayed as untouchable, a bastion of Russian power, equipped with advanced missiles, naval fleets, and air defense systems. Its isolation now exposes a different reality, that even the most fortified position is vulnerable when surrounded. Analysts explain that the enclave's strategic strength was based on mobility, its ability to connect, deploy, and respond. Once those connections are restricted, it becomes a static symbol, more valuable politically than militarily. Kaliningrad was designed as a fist, one European expert noted. Now it's a clenched hand that can't move. Within elite circles, the crisis has revived an old fear, that Russia's global posture exceeds its capacity to sustain it. Business leaders and technocrats quietly question whether the cost of projecting power abroad has undermined stability at home. "We built an empire of presence," one Moscow economist told a foreign correspondent, but presence is not the same as control. Such reflections rarely reach the public, but observers note that they are becoming more frequent in private discussions. The notion that an isolated enclave could become a liability rather than an asset represents a subtle but profound shift in thinking among the ruling class. In the Baltic region itself, the military balance grows increasingly asymmetric. NATO forces operate with the advantage of coordination and transparency. Russia, by contrast, acts through secrecy and improvisation. It's like two different languages, a defense analyst explained. One side relies on openness as deterrence, the other on unpredictability. The result is dangerous: transparency meets opacity, precision meets uncertainty. Every maneuver risks misinterpretation. While officials insist that communication channels remain open, insiders admit that trust has all but vanished. The Baltic, once a zone of cautious coexistence, now feels like a narrow corridor where every movement echoes. Inside Kaliningrad, life continues under visible strain. Residents adjust to shortages with stoic pragmatism. Long queues form at gas stations and supermarkets, though official reports describe supplies as sufficient. Public transport runs on restricted schedules, and local media focus heavily on patriotic programming. Teachers are instructed to discuss the resilience of the region with students, emphasizing unity and patience. Yet sociologists observing the region detect quiet anxiety. "People are calm," one researcher said, "but it's the calm of isolation, not peace, just distance." In Moscow, the leadership faces a paradox. Responding too aggressively risks escalation with NATO, doing nothing risks appearing weak. The Kremlin's preferred strategy, to wait and outlast, may no longer function in an environment where perception shapes outcomes faster than reality. In the age of surveillance and communication, an analyst remarked, waiting looks like retreat. Even allies interpret silence as hesitation. The challenge for Russia's leadership is psychological as much as strategic: how to maintain the image of control when control is slipping quietly away. Internationally, the standoff transforms the region's geopolitics. Poland's military buildup continues, with new air defense systems arriving along the border. Sweden's navy extends its patrols deeper into the Baltic, joined by Finland after its NATO accession. What was once a collection of separate security policies has become a coordinated front. Observers in Brussels describe it as integration by fear, countries aligning instinctively in response to perceived threat. For Russia, this represents a reversal of decades of influence. Every move to assert dominance now accelerates the formation of unity against it. Economically, Kaliningrad's predicament sends ripples through Russia's western trade networks. Freight traffic rerouted through alternative ports increases costs dramatically. Sanctions further limit the ability to import high-tech components necessary for industry and defense. The enclave's symbolic role as a showcase of integration with Europe has evaporated. Its factories, once oriented toward export markets, now stand idle or repurposed for domestic production. It was meant to be a window, one European diplomat observed. Now it's a mirror, reflecting Russia back to itself. The information environment mirrors this duality. State television broadcasts images of military drills and slogans of strength, while independent outlets, many operating from abroad, highlight empty shelves and power rationing inside the enclave. Citizens, caught between these two realities, navigate through uncertainty. The absence of reliable communication amplifies speculation. In moments of silence, rumor becomes the dominant narrative, and rumor always tilts toward fear. Political scientists warn that the Kaliningrad crisis, though geographically contained, represents a microcosm of Russia's broader dilemma. It reveals how a state built on projection must confront the limits of reach. The fortress that once symbolized expansion now symbolizes entrapment. And entrapment, once visible, spreads like contagion, from a region to an idea, from the edges of a map to the center of power itself. For those who want to follow how this quiet siege, physical, political, and psychological, reshapes Russia's internal dynamics and its standing in Europe, subscribing will keep you close to the deeper analysis that connects events on the Baltic coast to the shifts taking place in Moscow's halls of power. As the isolation of Kaliningrad deepens, the crisis begins to shift from a military standoff to a long-term geopolitical reality. What was initially seen as a temporary escalation has solidified into a durable pattern, one that neither side seems willing, nor able, to reverse. For the West, the goal has quietly evolved from deterrence to containment. For Russia, the challenge is no longer to defend Kaliningrad, but to maintain the illusion that control still exists. Behind the rhetoric of stability and readiness, a more complex truth unfolds. Moscow cannot fully protect the enclave, yet it cannot publicly admit vulnerability. They are trapped by their own image, one European analyst explained. To acknowledge the problem would be to acknowledge decline. Economically, Kaliningrad's isolation now resembles a siege by bureaucracy rather than by force. Every shipment entering the region faces inspection, every truck crossing the border is delayed. Lithuania insists that its procedures comply with EU sanctions, but the cumulative effect is paralysis. Each rule is small, a logistics operator said, but together they form a wall. Shipping routes through the Baltic offer little relief. Western naval presence makes every voyage an exercise in surveillance. Insurance rates for Russian vessels have tripled, and few companies are willing to risk their fleets for an uncertain profit. Analysts note that such restrictions, while officially administrative, achieve the same result as sanctions: economic suffocation through procedure. Inside the enclave, the strain becomes visible. Public transport operates irregularly, energy consumption is restricted in certain districts, and fuel prices continue to rise. Residents adapt in predictable ways, reducing travel, consolidating errands, avoiding unnecessary purchases. The local government insists that essential services remain unaffected, but independent observers describe growing fatigue. It's not panic, one sociologist said. It's the slow wear of endurance. Hospitals report shortages of imported medications, small factories suspend operations, and construction projects halt mid-progress. The rhythm of normal life persists, but hollowed out, a routine without progress, motion without destination. The political dimension of the crisis extends beyond geography. For Moscow, Kaliningrad's predicament highlights the limits of its reach in a world where military strength cannot overcome logistical dependence. They can send missiles, a European diplomat observed, but not milk. This contradiction exposes the fragility of an empire built on power projection but lacking redundancy. Every attempt to demonstrate strength, from naval exercises to public statements, only emphasizes the gap between symbolism and substance. In domestic terms, the crisis undermines one of the Kremlin's oldest promises, that distance is no obstacle to control. The notion that Russia can manage its peripheries effortlessly is fading, replaced by the visible truth of disconnection. Within the military establishment, frustration grows. Commanders stationed in the region report increasing logistical challenges, from spare parts to fuel to maintenance equipment. Communications remain stable but heavily monitored, and supply convoys require elaborate coordination through international waters. Officers privately express concern that the current arrangement is unsustainable. "You can defend a fortress," one former naval officer said, "but you can't feed it through a keyhole." These frustrations, though rarely voiced publicly, erode morale. Observers compare the mood to that of isolated outposts in earlier eras, proud, disciplined, but aware that reinforcements may never come. Internationally, the crisis has become both a symbol and a warning. For NATO, it demonstrates that containment can succeed without direct confrontation. For Russia's allies, it illustrates the risk of overextension. Even neutral observers acknowledge that the situation has redefined the meaning of deterrence. "This is 21st century warfare," an analyst in Brussels commented. "You don't attack, you isolate. You don't destroy, you surround." Such tactics, executed through regulation and coordination, achieve what armies once required invasion to accomplish. The blockade of Kaliningrad, undeclared yet undeniable, stands as a case study in quiet coercion. Inside Russia, the official narrative grows thinner with repetition. State media continues to insist that the situation is under control, airing footage of supply convoys and naval drills. But viewers notice the sameness, identical scenes broadcast week after week, with no new developments. Independent commentators call it synthetic stability, a strategy of distraction through monotony. The intent is not to convince but to exhaust. If people stop paying attention, one journalist observed, the problem stops existing politically. Yet in practice, fatigue does not erase awareness. It merely buries it deeper. As information control tightens, digital spaces outside the official ecosystem take on new significance. Channels on Telegram and other platforms, operated by military relatives or former residents, share fragments of truth, photographs of empty store shelves, videos of long fuel lines, reports of restricted movement. Though quickly deleted or blocked, these glimpses spread faster than censorship can contain them. The effect, analysts say, is corrosive rather than explosive. Each fragment of suppressed truth becomes proof of a larger lie. The economic indicators mirror this decay. Regional GDP contracts, unemployment rises, and private businesses close or relocate. With limited access to imports, industries reliant on European components are collapsing. The once promoted image of Kaliningrad as a gateway between Russia and Europe has inverted, it is now a cul-de-sac. Economists describe it as the end of geography, a place that exists strategically but functions economically as an island. Even tourism, once modest but steady, has vanished under travel restrictions and security alerts. Hotels operate at minimal capacity, and the once busy seaside resorts now host military convoys instead of visitors. In foreign capitals, policymakers watch closely. The standoff is seen as a test of endurance: who will tire first, Moscow or the West? For now, time favors the latter. Containment requires only patience, disruption demands constant effort. Russia must act to sustain an illusion, while NATO merely needs to wait. This asymmetry defines the balance of power in the Baltic. One side improvises to survive, the other consolidates by standing still. Analysts caution, however, that such imbalances do not remain static. The longer Moscow hesitates, the more permanent isolation becomes. The danger, one strategist warned, is that temporary walls become real borders. The fires of confrontation have not yet begun, but the embers of exhaustion already glow. What began as a tactical maneuver has turned into a slow redrawing of Europe's map, not with weapons, but with waiting. Several months into the Kaliningrad standoff, the story has settled into a quiet rhythm, a crisis without explosions, a conflict fought through distance and delay. The region remains isolated, not by war but by geography recalibrated through politics. No formal announcements are made, yet every border crossing, every inspection, every withheld permit reinforces the same reality. The enclave has become a pressure chamber suspended between two worlds. Moscow calls it resilience, Europe calls it containment. Both words describe the same phenomenon: endurance under constraint. Observers note that this form of confrontation is uniquely modern. It relies not on force but on friction, on the slow accumulation of barriers that make connection impossible. It's a siege made of silence, one analyst in Vilnius said. No one fires, but everything stops moving. The strategy's power lies in ambiguity. Without a declaration of war, there can be no formal retaliation. Without open aggression, there can be no diplomacy. The result is paralysis, a condition where every option carries risk, and inaction itself becomes policy. The longer it lasts, another expert remarked, the more permanent it becomes. Inside Kaliningrad, life continues in muted adaptation. The streets are orderly but subdued. Shops remain open, though their shelves grow emptier, factories operate, but production slows, public events occur, but attendance fades. Local authorities maintain a tone of measured optimism, speaking of temporary disruptions and seasonal adjustments. Yet residents describe a sense of suspension, as if time itself has slowed. "We're not waiting for war or peace," one teacher told a reporter. "We're waiting for something to change, and nothing does." Sociologists studying the region compare it to an island cut off from currents, stable, yet directionless. Moscow's response has become increasingly ritualistic. Official briefings repeat the same assurances, the same statistics, the same promises of normalization. The repetition, analysts argue, serves a purpose: to replace uncertainty with monotony. If the message doesn't change, one political consultant explained, people stop expecting news. But monotony, while numbing, does not restore trust. Citizens may no longer panic, but they also no longer believe. In this way, control becomes self-defeating. The effort to suppress anxiety creates detachment instead of loyalty. Internationally, Kaliningrad's isolation has quietly rewritten the strategic balance in Northern Europe. Sweden and Finland, now fully integrated into NATO structures, coordinate directly with Poland and the Baltic states. Joint exercises have become routine, and intelligence sharing occurs almost seamlessly. The once fragmented defense line along Russia's western flank has transformed into a continuous belt. "The map has changed," a senior NATO official noted. "Not through conquest, but through cooperation." This integration, analysts say, represents a long-term shift. The West's borders have grown not by expansion, but by cohesion. And cohesion, in geopolitical terms, is often more enduring than territory. For Russia, the consequences extend beyond geography. The Kaliningrad crisis has exposed the vulnerability of distance, the cost of holding territory disconnected from the mainland. It also reveals the limits of projection in a global environment that measures power not only by weapons but by access. Control is no longer about possession, an economist observed. It's about connection. And Russia is losing connection everywhere, digitally, economically, physically. The isolation of one region thus becomes a metaphor for the country itself, a vast landscape bound together by history, yet increasingly divided by circumstance. The psychological impact inside the Kremlin, though less visible, may prove lasting. Sources close to policy advisors describe an internal split between those who advocate for confrontation and those who favor containment through endurance. Both positions reflect weakness, not strength, the recognition that decisive victory is no longer attainable. They can neither advance nor retreat, a political scientist summarized. So they circle, waiting for the map to move around them. In a system built on momentum, immobility is the most dangerous form of defeat. In Europe, policymakers now refer to Kaliningrad as the silent front. The phrase captures its paradox, a front without battles, yet filled with consequences. Trade flows have shifted permanently, military doctrines are rewritten, regional identities are reshaped. What once symbolized confrontation now embodies caution. Even if the standoff eventually fades from headlines, its lessons remain. In the 21st century, power can be isolated without being destroyed. The walls need no mortar, bureaucracy, coordination, and patience are enough. Inside the enclave, that lesson feels tangible. Residents speak of themselves as living in two realities, the official narrative of stability and the private experience of stillness. The contrast defines daily life. Children play near armored vehicles parked on empty roads, factories produce goods that cannot be shipped, television screens broadcast promises of connection that no longer exist. A soldier stationed near the port put it simply in a message shared anonymously online: "We're not defending anything anymore. We're just here." The larger meaning of Kaliningrad's isolation, observers say, lies not in military outcomes but in psychological shifts. It marks the moment when Russia's projection of power met the limits of geography, when the edge of influence became the border of reach. This is not defeat in the old sense, an analyst concluded. It's erosion. It happens quietly, grain by grain, until what was once solid becomes dust. As the world's attention turns elsewhere, the siege will fade from headlines but not from consequence. The geography of Europe has changed without a single line redrawn, and the echo of that change will persist for years. The enclave remains, not fallen, not freed, but fixed in place, like a monument to the new kind of conflict shaping the 21st century, invisible, methodical, endless. For those who want to keep following how this invisible conflict, fought through distance, diplomacy, and attrition, continues to reshape Europe's balance of power and Russia's position within it. Subscribing will ensure you stay connected to the ongoing analysis that tracks these quiet yet decisive transformations.